Good morning, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Karen Holzer. I'm the Senior Director of Patient Advocacy here at BIO. Welcome to the first coffee chat of 2025. Um, so excited to be here and to be joined by a really stellar panel of amazing patient advocates. They will have an opportunity to introduce themselves in a second. But just really briefly, we have Jeff Allen, Paul Knaumeyer, and Genevieve Schneider. And we're here to talk about accelerated approval. Accelerated approval is a pathway that allows certain therapies that address unmet needs to come to market faster. Based on the last data I've seen, on average, like 3.2 years faster, which is huge for patients and families that are waiting for therapies. But we've seen a variety of coverage and reimbursement challenges from public payers and private payers. Based on some of the data that I've seen recently, we've seen really a large number of restrictions beyond what is on the FDA label, restricting who is able to get reimbursement and be covered for accessing the therapies, or really putting cumbersome restrictions on who can get access. Most recently, we've seen IBX, which is a Blue Cross Blue Shield plan in Pennsylvania, really restricting access to many drugs that have been approved through accelerated approval for 18 months until after approval, which is creating huge challenges for the patient community. And so we thought it would be great to get together, talk about what accelerated approval is, what a lot of the misconceptions around accelerated approval are, why it is so important for the patient community, and in particular, how we've been able to address some of the coverage and reimbursement challenges. So I'm really excited to have this conversation today. We'll start with some moderated panel discussion, but I want to make sure that we'll have a lot of time for questions from everybody from on the panel on the webinar today. And I know there are many other groups that are participating today, listening today, that have faced similar challenges. So please chime in. We'll have a lot of time at the end for you to share your experiences, to ask questions. I really want this to be interactive. But to start us off, I would love to hear from our three panelists a little bit about who you are, what your organization is representing, and why accelerated approval is so important for you and the community that you're representing. Jeff, would it be okay if we started with you?
Sure, sounds good. Thanks for the invite to join today's discussion. My name is Jeff Allen. I'm the president and CEO of Friends of Cancer Research, which is a Washington, D.C. based policy and advocacy organization. Obviously, as the name suggests, we predominantly focus on oncology. But of course, many of these various different policy tools in the regulatory space are applicable beyond just oncology, including accelerated approval, increasingly so in recent years. But I think this is a really important discussion to have. And specific to oncology, we've seen that since the inception of the accelerated approval pathways several decades ago, stretching back until the early 90s, oncology was one of the therapeutic areas in mind for the utilization of such a pathway that could approve a drug based upon an intermediate endpoint that is reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. And that's important in many areas where there is a serious unmet medical need or a significant risk for severe outcomes, including death. Unfortunately, that still is the case in many therapeutic areas, including oncology, despite the advancements that have been made. But while there have been advancements made, there also have been advancements in understanding the underlying biology and measurement of progression or presence of various different disease areas. And I think that's where the opportunity really comes in with a pathway like accelerated approval to be able to identify earlier on when a treatment could be beneficial. And we've seen in the oncology space that the utilization of the accelerated approval pathway has enabled earlier access to beneficial treatments. The trade-off for sort of that uncertainty that may come with evaluating an earlier endpoint is hopefully balanced by the requirement for drugs that are approved through accelerated approval to show confirmatory evidence in subsequent studies of the long-term benefit that they're able to provide. So that sort of helps to balance the earlier access on a perhaps less definitive endpoint as a long-term clinical outcome, and helps to further characterize the appropriate utilization, management, and understanding of these drugs that go through the pathway. So this is a source of sort of periodic debate, and I would expect that to continue in the years to come. But I think it's always useful for us to sort of check in on the current state of science and how these programs can be applied.
And I know your organization in particular has been instrumental in really helping to revise the pathway over time and really refine it. And so really looking forward to that conversation, also looking ahead what we can expect going forward. But before we go there, Paul, I would love to hear from you. I know you represent a community that has multiple products that were approved through accelerated approval. I know you've worked both with FDA on that part of the process, but then also with a lot of public and private payers to ensure that your community has access to these therapies.
Yeah, thank you, Karen, and similarly, very grateful to be invited to join the conversation today. I am Paul Mehlmeyer. I'm the Executive Vice President of Public Policy and Advocacy at the Muscular Dystrophy Association. We at MDA, we serve the neuromuscular disease community in a variety of different ways, but of course, I'm within the Public Policy and Advocacy Office based here in DC. And the neuromuscular disease community that we serve, each individual within this community, it's a rare disease that they have. Some can be on the more common side of rare diseases, but the vast majority of them are ultra rare. They're incredibly rare. Only 100 to 200 individuals within the patient population of the neuromuscular condition that they have. So in service of our community, we're talking about individuals who have rare diseases, and by and large, a lot of these rare diseases are slowly progressing. They are mostly genetic in nature, and by and large, they come from a mutation in a gene that produces a protein that's essential for the muscle or the neuromuscular junction or part of one's neurological system to function that then interacts with muscle, and then consequently will lead to muscle weakening over time. Some can be more severe. Some can be pretty apparent, oftentimes at birth, but many of these conditions are not actually evident at birth. They are diagnosed later in life, oftentimes in childhood, sometimes even in adulthood. And then from there, the progression of the condition can be slow, can be heterogeneous, but then also is oftentimes irreversible because we still don't have the technology as of yet to actually reverse muscle damage, to repair muscle in this kind of way, and to build muscle back from the loss that had occurred because of the disease in question. So because of the nature of these neuromuscular conditions, the accelerated approval pathway is incredibly important to our community because the accelerated approval pathway allows products to be approved based upon the surrogate endpoints that then reasonably predicts a likelihood of a clinical benefit. And within our population, it's oftentimes the presence or lack thereof of this protein that is incredibly important to the function of muscle. And if we can be approving products based upon the presence or lack thereof of that protein, rather than waiting to see whether the muscle will be impacted over a large amount of time that then will lead to functional benefit and clinical benefit, this gets products to our community incredibly more quickly than they would if we were relying on clinical benefit alone. So consequently, accelerated approval is very important. As Karen, you mentioned, there are a number of products that have been approved by the FDA within our space via the accelerated approval pathway. We expect that to continue. And given those approvals, we have lots of experience, unfortunately perhaps, or maybe fortunately, with what the payer community has placed at our feet when it comes to actually covering these therapies. So happy to go into those further later on, but for now, Karen, thanks again for the opportunity.
Great. So great to have you. And I know there'll be lots of questions from the audience today about like how do you actually work constructively with payers on to make sure that there is access for these important products. But next, I would love to go to Jenna, to you and switch gears just a little bit. I know the community that you represent. For your community, accelerated approval is equally vitally important. Can you talk a little bit about why that is and kind of what experiences you've had so far with the accelerated approval pathway?
Sure, happy to. And again, echoing the thank you for having me today. I'm Jenna Riemenschneider. I'm the Vice President of Advocacy and Policy at the Asthma and Allergy Foundation of America, also known as AFA. We're the leading patient advocacy organization dedicated to the more than 100 million people in the United States with asthma and allergic diseases. It's our mission to save lives and reduce the burden of disease for these people through support, advocacy, education, and research. The accelerated approval pathway is really important to our community because obviously it allows for earlier access to these innovative therapies. But I think we really represent that unmet need. We know that too many patients face the limited treatment or no treatment options, and the current approval process can take years. And we are very supportive of when a drug shows promise in addressing one of those unmet needs that patients should not have to wait. I'm really going to focus on our community in the food allergy space because they urgently need more treatment options. There's currently only 2 FDA-approved treatment options for food allergy. Palforzia, which is an oral immunotherapy, was approved in 2020. And this is for children with peanut allergies specifically, ages 4 to 17. And then Xolair, which was just approved last year, new indication, which is an injectable biologic for patients 1 year and older with any food allergy. And while neither of these treatments are a cure, they do help reduce the risk of serious allergic reactions to maybe an accidental exposure. This is what we call being like bite proof. Like if you accidentally took a bite of something, you are less likely to have a serious allergic reaction, also known as anaphylaxis. But there is currently a new therapy for peanut, specifically peanut allergic toddlers, ages 1 through 3, that is currently seeking accelerated approval. And this is really big for our community because it's, it would be the first non-injectable treatment option for this incredibly vulnerable age group, ages 1 to 3. But of course, it has also faced delays. And again, while peanut allergy is a major concern, this is just one of the top 9 major allergens that account for over 90% of food allergies. So, for our community, if we don't protect the accelerated approval pathway, we risk delays in not only this peanut patch for toddlers, but future treatments that address the other allergens that, would lead to potentially unnecessary delays. And this does impact millions of families that do not have options for better management of their life-threatening food allergies.
And I know accelerated approval is so important for so many other respiratory vaccines and infectious disease agents and asthma therapies. So I know that accelerated approval is so important for so much of your space.
We represent a very large community, and we have seen, we'll talk more about some of the coverage issues we've seen that are more in the asthma space as well.
So taking a step back, why do we see so much hesitancy and so much concern among the payer community? I know, Jeff, you already mentioned it, but in its core, what is accelerated approval and what are some of the misconceptions that we're hearing? And Jeff, you already started talking about it. You want to go a little bit deeper into explaining what accelerated approval is and what it is not?
Sure. I think what accelerated approval is intended to do is provide timely access to potentially beneficial new therapies. And when you look historically across, I guess I'll focus on oncology. It's a little bit easier to sort of use that as a somewhat common denominator, just because different therapeutic areas may have different disease trajectories. But when you look at the application of accelerated approvals in oncology, in many instances, this provides access to new therapies on the magnitude of 1 to 3 years earlier than if one had to wait for an endpoint like overall survival to be fully evaluated. And that's not meant to dismiss the importance of those long-term outcomes, but it is a balance, particularly for those individuals that are afflicted with a serious or life-threatening illness. Having that timely access to a new compound in that 1 to 3 year period is extremely important, for any individual afflicted with those types of conditions. Now, I think it is important to recognize that these are based on endpoints that are reasonably likely to predict benefit. So oftentimes you can hear sort of different terms that have similarities, but significant differences. Things like an intermediate endpoint versus a surrogate endpoint. One being an earlier indicator of potential long-term benefit, where a surrogate may refer more toward a replacement or something that has been fully verified to be a predictor of a subsequent event. That takes a great deal of evidence, as it should, in order to establish surrogacy or replacement for an endpoint. And so that's why the law was written in such a way that it is based on the reasonably likelihood. But with that also comes the potential that it may not always be 100% predictive of a long-term outcome. And that has been the case historically. If you look across the experience in oncology, there have been nearly 200 indications that have been approved by accelerated approval for different types of cancers at different stages for different drugs. Of that 200, about 15% of them have gone on to not confirm their benefit and have subsequently been withdrawn for that indication. That is a reflective of the uncertainty that one might be willing to accept in these circumstances of serious and life-threatening illnesses where there's an unmet medical need. So just to kind of bridge your question a little bit, Karen, that level of uncertainty, I think, is what has been questioned by payers as whether it should be covered at the same rates as a drug that has fully gone through a confirmed process, a long-term evaluation, including post-market characterization of a product. But I think it's important to remember whether you're talking about accelerated approval on an intermediate endpoint, full approval based on an established endpoint. With any drug, there's very likely to be continued learning and characterization of its optimal use throughout the life cycle of the product. And that's true in the clinical trial process. That's true in the post-market process. And I think we have to, accept and hopefully work, with the broader community, the healthcare systems, field experts, epidemiologists, to try and generate that evidence as expeditiously and sufficiently as possible. But it is something that is sort of a life cycle process for any given drug.
And I know your organization in particular has worked with FDA and Congress over the years to really refine that process and to make sure that there are the appropriate checks and balances. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the checks and balances that are in place to make sure that the products that are approved for accelerated approval are efficacious, even if they're based on an intermediate endpoint or surrogate endpoint?
So, first and foremost, at the hallmark of the program is the requirement for developing confirmatory evidence, which most frequently is in the form of a subsequent clinical trial, typically larger than the trial that may have been used to grant the original accelerated approval. So steps have been taken within recent years to provide even additional authorities to monitor that process and take action in the event that the confirmatory evidence does not support the continued utilization of a product for that particular indication for which an accelerated approval was given. And that has been one that has been a challenge historically in certain circumstances. Although I would argue that, we've seen, at least in the oncology space, oftentimes this has been a collaborative process, both in terms of establishing the parameters of the post-market trials that are required, as well as agreement on what the magnitude of benefit should be and to be an indicator of efficacy, and oftentimes a somewhat seamless process for removing any indications. Hasn't always been the case, but I think with greater experience of some of those processes have been put into place on a more informal basis. But Congress has also acted recently to kind of codify those types of authorities, make for a simplified process should a withdrawal need to occur, provide some additional tools for FDA to help ensure that the confirmatory evidence is generated in an expeditious and timely fashion, including things like the ability to require that a confirmatory trial is sufficiently enrolled prior to granting an accelerated approval, in hopes that that will help ultimately get to the evidence that's needed. I think that has been a challenge historically, because you could imagine very realistically that for a new drug that is put on the market, even in the case of an intermediate endpoint, to treat a serious and life-threatening condition, of course, anyone afflicted with that condition may want to have access to that drug. So it may become more challenging, oftentimes questionable in terms of the feasibility and ethics of conducting a randomized trial in that case when there has been evidence that has already been generated. But it doesn't always pan out, so the conduct of these trials is really important. So there actually is an active guidance now that FDA has put out for public comment around some of these parameters associated with sufficient enrollment for confirmatory trials prior to awarding an accelerated approval. And we've seen that having trials open and sufficiently enrolled has increased the rate of completion of post-market studies as one tool. But I think these are important discussions and considerations to have, because particularly for rare conditions, this could be a challenge that needs to be planned for upfront in terms of, how to balance the conduct of maybe even multiple trials at the same time, hopefully not impeding access to a potentially beneficial product.
So if I may just briefly summarize what I think I heard, basically, FDA, Congress, and other parties have worked to really ensure that there are checks and balances in place, that products that went through the accelerated approval pathway are efficacious. Is that kind of a fair summary?
Yes, and to make sure that the information is generated in a timely fashion. And I think it's important to recognize that information is not going to be instantaneous. And when you're talking about running a subsequent clinical trial, oftentimes this could take a number of years. And so, when you look at statistics for drugs that have gone through accelerated approval, there is a component of them that are still pending results of their confirmatory trials. Obviously, we don't want to see that go on for an unnecessary extensive period of time, because that confirmatory evidence is really important in providing sufficient information, implementing into medical care. But it will take time, and that has to be well planned for in order to try and make sure that that evidence is generated in a timely manner.
That makes perfect sense. So, Paul, I know your community has, as you mentioned, tremendously benefited from products that have been approved to accelerated approval, and to Jeff's point around kind of speed and timeliness, and looking at some of the access barriers, including that recent IBX coverage that for 18 months restricts coverage. 18 months in the life of many patients is a huge time period. What are your reactions? What are your experiences? What are your thoughts on the accelerated approval pathway, the way it's been working, and how it's been impacting your community?
Yeah, thank you, Karen. Well, everything that Jeff mentioned on the continuous improvement of the accelerated approval pathway is important, and that includes the reforms from the Consolidated Appropriations Act in 2022 that are further refining accelerated approval in important ways. So it's important to mention, as Jeff said, to really all stakeholders that an accelerated approval pathway is a living pathway that continues to be refined and improved. When we look at the post-approval environment, we've unfortunately had lots of experience with how payers are approaching therapies approved via accelerated approval. Within our space, there are several therapies approved for Duchenne muscular dystrophy that were approved via accelerated approval, and then also a therapy approved for ALS, specifically for a genetic form of ALS, SOD1 ALS. Qalsody is the name of that. And what we've seen from a number of different payers is a reluctance to cover these therapies as they may view therapies approved via accelerated approval in three different ways. And they put this officially within their non-coverage or limited coverage determinations. They will consider them to be either experimental, which of course is not true, given that they are FDA approved. They are no longer an experimental therapy. They will consider them as non-medically necessary, which is perhaps the most patently false approach that they can take, given that the very qualification for their accelerated approval pathway in the very first place is that it must be a therapy that treats a serious condition with an unmet medical need. And consequently, of course, it's going to be medically necessary and not medically necessary, as some payers may say. And then the other approach is that whether it's experimental or not medically necessary, there are other ways in which they can cite that therapies should not be covered within their given plans. And so these of course are either misconceptions or willful misconceptions that the insurers will use in determining to not cover therapies approved via accelerated approval. Now, oftentimes we have been able to successfully overturn such coverage determinations. Of course, it can depend on the insurer and depend on the kind of insurance it is, and we can dive further into that later on if would like. But we've been able to, with many partners in our space, and I should give a lot of credit to the other patient organizations in especially the Duchenne and ALS space. And we've seen, especially the Little Hercules Foundation, for example, within the Duchenne space, having a lot of success in working with payers and working with families to overturn non-coverage decisions and determinations. But oftentimes it's countering the arguments that these insurers make in the first place for these therapies being experimental, which they're not, or saying they're not medically necessary. They are medically necessary. And oftentimes there'll be other covered limitations that aren't based in science, such as within the Duchenne space, that steroids must be administered for a certain amount of time prior to access to a gene therapy, let's say. That's not medically required. That doesn't come from experts within Duchenne. That's a tactic used by insurers to delay access to this therapy. Other restrictions, such as age restrictions or ambulation restrictions, or there can't be other therapies that are administered at the same time as a therapy administered via or therapy approved via accelerated approval. None of these are based in science. None of these are based upon FDA's approval. None of these are based upon the knowledge and expertise of Duchenne experts, or ALS experts in certain cases. So by working with the insurers to kind of knock down these coverage limitations, by going through the appeals processes that are available to communities that are being denied access to therapies, oftentimes these non-coverage determinations can be overturned. But nonetheless, understanding where we see these non-coverage determinations being applied, which by and large are the more expensive therapies approved via accelerated approval, which again shows that it's not actually the accelerated approval necessarily that's of concern. It's perhaps other reasons that insurers may be concerned for covering therapies. moving through these processes to overturn these non-coverage determinations has largely been successful in many areas. But to your point, Karen, there are new and innovative ways that different insurers may be using to try to find ways not to cover therapies via accelerated approval. And Independence Blue Cross Blue Shield is certainly taking an innovative approach within their non-coverage announcement from the last couple of months. Consequently, the conversations will continue with them, but also with others who we imagine may take similar approaches.
And just taking a step back, putting myself into the shoes of a patient or family, what does it mean? So it sounds like a lot of these coverage decisions ultimately take time. And if I heard you correctly in the beginning, time is muscle. So time is the one thing that patients often don't have. What's the impact of all of this on the patients and families that you're representing?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that back, Karen. It's critically important to be treating as soon as possible within essentially every neuromuscular condition. I mean, thinking about over to genetic ALS, SOD1 ALS, in which Qalsody has been approved. It's a rapidly progressing condition once there's symptom onset, with unfortunately individuals oftentimes passing away within a year, oftentimes even within 3 to 6 months of being diagnosed with SOD1 ALS. And I know folks from the ALS Association are on the call today. So an area in which they have been very instrumental in trying to ensure access to Qalsody for those with SOD1 ALS. And within Duchenne, even though Duchenne, of course, progresses more slowly than forms of genetic ALS may progress, each day boys with Duchenne are losing functionality that we technologically don't know how to regain for them. Now, there are stories of boys with Duchenne who have progressed and had more trouble running or walking, who have received the gene therapy that has been approved for Duchenne, and then actually regaining some of that function, at least temporarily. And that's, of course, very exciting. But pertaining to the specific etiology of muscle loss, that is something that we as a field technologically don't know how to reverse, don't know how to regain muscle. And so functionality that's lost within these neuromuscular conditions just simply can't be regained. For the most part, at least with the technology that we have today. So as we're talking about delays in access to therapy, even a month or two matters. Certainly several months, certainly a year matters incredibly to the life of an individual with a neuromuscular condition. This is why we see individuals within neuromuscular disease communities that don't yet have a therapy approved. And I think about those within the limb-girdle muscular dystrophy space, in which you have boys and girls with limb-girdle who are progressing within their condition, who are really expecting and hoping that a therapy can progress through the accelerated approval pathway, because it means that they may be able to receive a therapy while they're still able to walk. Whereas if the therapy was not approved via accelerated approval, or if it was and an insurance company denied access to it, that child might lose the ability to walk and consequently not regain that. That's the kind of stuff that we're talking about with these delays here. So time is of the essence for sure. And that's why we do use the phrase time is muscle, because these functionalities may not be able to be regained with every delay that comes from not being able to receive a therapy.
So true. So Jenna, you mentioned that you are getting ready for a potential market entry of an accelerated approval product. And based on the experiences that both Jeff and Paul mentioned and that you alluded to, I would assume that you are probably planning for how to work with the payer community. Can you talk a little bit about that and how are you getting ready?
Absolutely. So I mentioned, one of the drugs earlier in the peanut allergy space, and there's two. Well, funny thing happened several years ago. Before either of these drugs were approved, there was an ICER evaluation on them. So this was ahead of FDA approval. You got a value assessment, and they had recommendations about coverage determinations and prior auth related to Palforzia, which did not have accelerated approval, but I think we have learned from that experience that there will likely be coverage issues with the peanut patch moving forward. And we've also seen this with other treatment in our disease area that have, taken not necessarily accelerated approval, but the other potentially non-traditional pathways like fast track and priority review. And so we have engaged in direct outreach to payers. We've also engaged with state Medicaid programs and their P&T committees, really trying to highlight the importance to patients, the impacts on patients. And we've done this, by really preparing a lot of patient-driven data. We have, with others, conducted patient-focused drug development meetings for food allergy, for asthma, pediatric asthma, and for eczema. We get a lot of good patient stories from that. We also conduct our own. So we have done things like My Life with Asthma, My Life with Food Allergy, and really trying to inject the patient experience into all of our communication. So with that direct outreach to payers, we've also really tried to tap into our clinicians and the medical professional groups because, in theory, these coverage determinations are being made by other physicians. And we hope that is the case. So, really getting the clinical community behind, why this, is medically necessary, the unmet need. We've, had some success. I know in one case recently, we didn't, if we had the magic bullet for coverage of all the drugs needed as prescribed, I would definitely share that. I don't know that we have that, but we have, I think we're all working towards that together. We have had some success where, maybe there wasn't like utilization management was not removed for all patients for, a certain asthma biologic, but it was removed if you met, there's one phenotype that there is only one asthma biologic that addresses that. And we were able to get a state Medicaid program to, actually say, like, if you have low T2 asthma, you don't have to go through any prior authorization or step therapy in order to get this drug. So small victories are important. But another, I think one of the more interesting ways we've seen payers try to limit coverage was actually making determinations based on clinical trial design rather than the FDA indication. So, for instance, this was with the Xolair indication for food allergy. The FDA had approved this drug for anyone 1 year of age and over and any allergen, but the clinical trial, had exclusion criteria like you couldn't have severe asthma or severe eczema, very common comorbid conditions in food allergy, and you had to have peanut and at least 2 other food allergies that were, not even all of the top 9. And so, they were trying to make coverage determinations that looked just like the trial, even though that was not what the FDA indication was. And we did this was an instance where really engaging the medical professionals, we were able to get there were several big payers that essentially retracted what their plans had been to really closely mimic the clinical trial, based on, I think, a lot of that clinical input. So, we're trying to beef up our arsenal. I do think that the combined efforts of, patient orgs, patient stories, why it's important, and then working with the medical professional communities, really, I think that is where we are preparing to likely fight payer decisions. And then, I think we might be talking about this a little bit, but like obviously private and public payers, there are some differences there and the approaches. But, I think ultimately continued, and I know Paul mentioned, like collaborating with other patient organizations in our disease areas has been critically important in making sure that we have one unified voice. So we're going to continue to do that moving forward. And hopefully, with discussions like this, we're really raising the awareness that these are not experimental. These are not, less safe or less effective treatments just because they were approved a certain way, and really getting through to the payer community.
Thank you so much. And both you and Paul raised the important issue of not all payers are created equal. So I don't know if you or Paul have any kind of best practices for working or being effective with Medicaid versus Medicare versus private payers. Any thoughts there? Understanding that the legal structures, etc., are a little bit different.
Well, I can start, and I'll just say that we have seen differences across the different payers in their willingness to cover products approved via accelerated approval. And sometimes it's not just willingness, sometimes it's the law. Like within Medicaid, for example, the Medicaid drug rebate program requires Medicaid programs to cover therapies. And where we see there is more so within managed Medicaid, and states were broadly just finding ways to delay coverage of therapies, oftentimes approved via accelerated approval, but that delay is temporary. Pretty much invariably, we see that eventually these therapies are covered within Medicaid because they have to be, because that's the law. Over within Medicare, there again we see the difference between Medicare Advantage plans and within more traditional Medicare. And there's where we saw the success of the ALS community led by ALS Association to ensure coverage of Qalsody for those with SOD1 ALS within Medicare Advantage plans. And again, within Medicare, you're going to have a different population covered by Medicare because they're primarily covering older adults, those eligible for Medicare via the Social Security Disability Insurance Program, SSDI, and then those diseases that are kind of carved into Medicare, such as ALS. And so really it's primarily within private coverage that we've seen the biggest issues. And there's differences between employer covered plan or self-insured employer plans and non-self-insured, fully insured, if you will, plans that are purchased off the marketplace most often. It's those plans that we'll see more frequently, especially within Blue Cross Blue Shield plans, that we see these non-coverage decisions, that we see there's the limited coverage decisions. And then for employers, especially for these self-insured plans, it can be a whole different ballgame considering there might only be 30, 40, 50 people in a small self-insured plan. And if there's one individual seeking a gene therapy, that just might be unaffordable. So at that point, it's about having reinsurance for these self-insured plans and ensuring that reinsurance is going to cover the cost of the gene therapy, which right now it's not required to do. So it definitely depends on the plan and the kind of plan that it is for the tactic to try to get a non-coverage determination overturned. For plans that are fully insured, private plans purchased through the marketplace, there's a required appeals process that oftentimes does work. Sometimes it's pressure campaigns, sometimes it's petitions, and sometimes it's going to local news to talk about a child who's being denied coverage to a incredibly impactful gene therapy or incredibly impactful therapy in general that's approved by the FDA. Sometimes it takes a pressure campaign in that manner that those in our community have led before. So it just depends on the kind of insurance for what's going to work. But by and large, there have always been successful ways to get these non-coverage determinations overturned.
That is encouraging to hear. Jenna, anything to add from your perspective?
I would just add, I think Paul made excellent points about, all the different players and how important that is. I think we just, in, our approaches, while AFA's approach may vary, like at our core, we still, try to do that social listening, bringing the example of, the story of like this person is impacted. It really does take so much time to go through the appeals process. So, really trying to emphasize the impact on someone's life that, something like this takes. We just, we always try to be the patient voice first and foremost, and then tactically, how do we harness that to all the different players?
That makes sense. I do want to make sure that we have enough time for questions. But before we go to audience questions, one thing that we always try to do is share resources. Jeff, I know you all have pulled together amazing resources. Can you talk a little bit about where people can go if they want to learn a little bit more about the process, the history, what accelerated approval is, and kind of where can people learn more?
Sure. I'm happy to drop in the chat a sort of a regularly updated assessment that we included on our website that tracks the utilization of a number of different expedited pathways, including accelerated approval. Has a lot of data around the types of endpoints that have been used, the timeframes. We are in the process of working to update some of that information to include additional indications outside of oncology. Right now, it is focused on oncology, but I think we have seen in the last several years that there has been an expanded use of accelerated approval, in particular into other therapeutic areas. And I think that's a really important effort for the patient advocacy community and the medical community at large to help identify what some of those endpoints are that could serve as reasonably likely measures, and help develop the evidence to support that, and in turn help educate not only regulators but payers around the strength of evidence surrounding those potentially new endpoints. And I think that would be a valuable focus into the future.
Amazing. If you send us the link, we are happy to distribute that after the meeting, and the chat works really well too. Before we go to audience questions, Paul and Jenna, from the coverage and reimbursement space, any recommendations for where people can go? In particular, I'm thinking about patient group that might be facing similar challenges, or individual patients that might be facing some of these coverage challenges that both of your organizations have been so effective at overcoming. Any recommendations there?
For AFA, I would say we have a support center, as well as community forums where you can join AFA if you're experiencing this, we want to know and to help. And of course, my personal contact information, if you have questions, I'm sure is going to be shared in all of this, but Jenna R at aafa.org. But yeah, we want to continue to be a resource. And I think something that Jeff just mentioned about educating regulators, that's also very important. We, even to get the accelerated approval pathway for this one drug, we and other food allergy groups have had to meet with FDA several times, send them letters just describing that this is an unmet need. So, if there are opportunities in your space, I would also encourage you to do that.
Yeah, and as for us, specific to neuromuscular diseases, of course, our resource center is active in assisting our community, as are a number of the other patient organizations in the space, as I already mentioned, for the most part. So they're all excellent resources. I would say, just if I was a patient organization who's anticipating encountering challenges with coverage and access to a therapy approved via accelerated approval, the things I would be doing would be to predict essentially any and every argument that an insurer will try to use to try to not cover or limit coverage for the therapy. So within the Duchenne case, it's the steroids and the other therapies and the ambulation versus non-ambulation and all those ways in which they're using these arguments not to cover. Be prepared for those. Have all of the counter evidence pointing out why those non-coverage decisions are specious and are incorrect. Have all of that prepared and ready to go. And then just be very educated on the appeals process. Be prepared to take patients through that, and be prepared to tell the community that a no at the outset is not actually a no. There are many recourses that a family and that a community can take to turn a no into a yes within non-coverage determinations. So do not despair if a no happens. That's just the very start of the process, not the end of the process.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. I want to see if there are any questions, comments from the community. And I know we have a number of other patient groups on the call too that have faced similar challenges. So if any of you want to share any best practices or experiences, I've seen some of it in the chat already. But this is an opportunity for anyone to speak up.
Hi, Karen, it's Rich. Wanted to make sure everybody saw in the chat. We had put a pretty considerable effort, as Paul had alluded to. There's a lot of these one-offs where we receive inquiry from somebody that has been denied, and since we're focused on the drug side, we always make sure to do what we can, and everybody has their kits that they're developing. So I'll also post one that we have. Because it can get complex pretty quickly, especially these external appeals. Medicare, Department of Veterans Affairs, if it's an ERISA plan, if it's a Medicaid plan, there's different jurisdictions to go through. But I would say that we're trying to help to make this process more transparent by arming individuals with information. And I think that's probably the biggest lesson is how can we explain this process to make sure that people do try to appeal these decisions. Right now, the appeal levels are about 11%. So people are simply too scared to even go through the process. So they can get success if they go through the actual process, as Paul was saying, where those numbers turn out. But indeed, we also need to continue to advocate at CMS level. Obviously we did what we could with getting them educated about Qalsody and its medical benefits, to have them have their coverage determination and memo come out to Medicare Advantage plans. So but that's just one, that's just one of the many pieces of the puzzle that need to be, fought for. So I would say that it's really important. I think the other part of this is I've had conversations at the FDA level. I think that they're aware that there's a diminishing of accelerated approval, at least, as far as, that needs to be addressed, I think, still at the federal level. We still need to have these conversations with the various agencies, even at NIH as well. I just don't want to see this, especially for the rare disease community, those that are seeking approval through accelerated approval, that somehow that there are arbitrary barriers placed up, not only because if people, that's one thing, we can get approval through FDA, that's a huge effort. But having a delay or denial of a drug that's been approved has real consequences, especially those who are going through very progressive disease states and that they need these products as soon as possible. So thank you for allowing me to comment.
Thank you for being here. I know you all have done an amazing job educating about what this means and the importance of accelerated approval. Kelly, I saw that you came off on camera, and I know you have done a tremendous amount of work in this space as well. Any comments?
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much for all these comments. It's really informative, and I appreciate it. And for the limb-girdle community, as Paul mentioned earlier, LGMD2I Foundation, and for our community, we do have a drug. It's in phase 3, and hoping to seek accelerated approval here in the next year. And so I'm just trying to think how I can learn from you all that have so much more experience from ALS Association and MDA, that have had approvals. What can we do proactively to try to ensure coverage? Ironically, you started off the meeting today talking about Pennsylvania and Blue Cross Blue Shield, which is where I live and what coverage I personally have. So I found that quite ironic to start off the conversation. So, I do have a daughter with LGMD2I and certainly hope that we can get her this potential treatment covered if it does get accelerated approval access. And so I'm just learning so much and trying to take it all in today. So thank you for that information.
Thank you so much. I know we're at time. I saw Michelle put in the chat a really important question for us at Bio, which is about the timing of our coffee chat. I know we've iterated between noon and 9 a.m. So if you have any strong feelings for what works better, please either put them in the chat or let me know. And please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists. I personally learned so much from the conversation today. We will compile the resources that were shared in the chat as a follow-up. And you can certainly at any time follow up with me, and I'm happy to make any connections. It seems like there's a lot of opportunity to learn from each other and to join forces to make sure that this really important coverage pathway continues to be as strong and robust as it is. And hopefully every patient will have timely access to these important therapies.
I want to also thank Karen, who did an amazing job, and she the hostess with the mostest. So and I know you all know Karen, and we are so fortunate to have her here at Bio. So thank you, Karen. That was an outstanding chat, and just all the comments speak to that in the chat.
With that, thank you all so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day.